Hi everyone, it's Kylie from Payne. In this video, I'll be going over value and water to paint ratios. I often get asked how much water I use while painting, and I have a hard time answering that question for two reasons. First, it is honestly difficult to quantify exactly how much water I'm using. Sure, I can say a lot or not much, but that's not exactly that helpful. And secondly, how much water you use while painting really depends on what you're trying to achieve. So in this video, I'll talk about one main thing that water affects while painting with watercolors, and that is value. So first off, what is value? Value is the lightness or darkness of a color, and the value of color while painting with watercolors is determined by how much water you mix into your pigment. The more water you add to your pigments, the more diluted and lighter the color will appear, and for rich, deep, saturated colors, you'll use less water. Also, when talking about the amount of water, I want to clarify that I'm talking about the ratio of water to pigment, not how much paint is mixed up on your palette. If you aren't sure how much water to use while painting, it can be helpful to first practice making different values. I'll be demonstrating how to create 5 separate values using the color Payne's Gray. I'm going to start off by adding water to my palette. I'm just going to add clean water with my brush, and then I'll lightly dip my brush into gray paint and add it to the water. I'm just spinning my brush around to fully incorporate the colors. By using this white palette, I can see how light the gray looks before adding it to my paper. Next, I'll be painting a saturated Payne's Gray swatch. For very saturated colors, you'll still need to dip your brush into water, but this time I'll be dipping my brush right into my paint well. If you have pans, you'll just dip it right into your pan. You can see how dark and rich the pigment appears right out of the tube. I'm rotating my brush to really absorb the pigment, and then I'll apply it to my paper. I usually dip my paint directly into the well if I want a very saturated pigment. Next, I'll create a medium value Payne's Gray. Again, I'll be mixing on my palette. I'm first adding water to the palette, and then I'll load up my brush with pigment and add it to the water. So I'm still loading it up like I did for the dark value, but this time I'm just adding it to the water on the palette. And if you add too much pigment, you can always add more water to the mixture. And there's my medium value gray. Now I'll add another light value gray that's in between the light and the medium. And then I'll add another dark value that's between the medium and the darkest value. I mentioned earlier that value is determined by the ratio of pigment to water, but the type and size of brush you're using will affect how much paint can be picked up and applied to your paper. A large fluffy brush like this can absorb a lot of paint, whereas a small brush can only pick up a little bit. So even though I'm dipping into the same watery mixture, depending on what brush I use, I'll get different amounts of paint. As for a very saturated color that doesn't use a lot of water, if I use this big fluffy brush, you can see it skipping a little bit, and you can see the paper texture showing through. This is what's usually referred to as a dry brush technique. So if you want to paint a lot with this very saturated gray, you would have to keep redipping your brush into the pigment. So I'm going to keep doing the same thing with just some different colors. Here's burnt sienna, and then I'll do a green swatch as well. Now if you accidentally add a lighter value to your paper than you wanted, you can always increase it by adding more pigment directly to your paper. So here's a diluted Payne's gray. And if I want to increase the value to a medium gray, I'm just going to add in some pigment and blend things out. And you can also do the reverse. You can add more water to your wash to decrease the value. So now let's add some water to lighten the wash. I am doing all of this while things are still wet. I'm just adding more water and then wiping off my brush in between. There is a little dark pigment on the outer edge of the wash, but the overall color is a lot lighter. There are other lifting techniques you can use to decrease the value, and I can demonstrate that in a future video. And you also can increase the value using wet on dry techniques, by creating multiple layers of a color to get the value darker. Using a lot of water not only decreases the value, but also makes paint more difficult to control. You can see the paint beading up on the edge of the wash, and you can manipulate the wash by moving your paper around. If you have enough water, you can also create drips by moving your paper vertically. Adding extra water will dilute your paint and decrease the value. But using a wet on wet technique, you can always load up your brush with saturated pigment and add directly to the wash for bold, dark colors. So it is possible to use a lot of water while painting and have bold colors as well. You just need to make sure you're adding a lot of pigment into your water. One thing to keep in mind though, while using a wet on wet technique to add pigment to a wet wash, the colors may dilute while the wash is drying. You'll notice that the thin gray lines just vanished and the gray dot stayed, and that's because it was full of pigment. In order to avoid this, you need to either use a lot more saturated pigment, or you need to make sure your wash is dried a little and isn't so wet. So if I wanted these stripes to stay, I should have added them to a damp wash instead. Next I'll be showing some examples of me painting. You'll see me create loose expressive washes, and then I'll show some tight detailed areas. One thing that helps determine how much paint actually gets added to your paper will be the brushes you choose to use. You'll notice for the looser areas I'm using more paint and I'm also using larger brushes. And then for the tight details I'm using more saturated pigment and small paint brushes. Thank you guys so much for watching. Just remember that it does take time to learn watercolors. It takes a lot of practice and experimenting to see what you like and don't like. So don't worry if you don't get it right away. If there's anything you have questions about, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye now.